curious about how the Indian state really works, its levers of power, tech ambitions, and geopolitical maneuvers. Explore it all through one of three specializations in our 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Applications close August 24th.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. I'm Aishwaria Sonavane, research analyst for Pakistan studies at the Takshashila Institution. As the season inevitably turns our attention to this historic event of partition, I want to move beyond familiar narratives to examine how that defining moment continues to shape the political trajectories, identities, and sovereignty of both India and Pakistan. Joining me is Atul Mishra, an academician, author of The Sovereign Lives of India and Pakistan, as well as a mentor to our Network for Advanced Study of Pakistan Fellowship. His work brings identity and long-running historical processes to the forefront, challenging the view of partition as merely a political or colonial event. Welcome, Atul. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Aishwarya. Glad to be here. Very glad to be here.
Let me begin by asking, how essential is the dimension of identity in understanding the ongoing impact of partition on India-Pakistan ties today? It seems that this aspect is often overshadowed by conventional political, geopolitical narratives.
Right. So, Aishwarya, if you want to gauge the importance of something, you want to see how it fares, how it compares with its competitors. And there are really just two basic factors that explain the conflictual dynamic in India-Pakistan relations. One is the imbalance of power, which is very difficult to correct. And the other is conflicting identities, which are impossible to reconcile. So if you look at the imbalance of power, what we notice is that India is several times more powerful than Pakistan, and the gap continues to grow. This, of course, makes Pakistan insecure, and it has tried various measures to draw parity with India, such as developing nuclear weapons or trying out terrorism. And it has ensured that at least since the 1950s, there's at least one great power at any point that is engaged in South Asia. All of this, of course, irritates India. The interesting thing here is that this imbalance of power, it came into existence and it developed and it has taken shape after partition. Now let's look at the other factor, which, as I mentioned earlier, is identity. Identity has a longer lineage, and I believe that it is a better factor insofar as explaining the India-Pakistan relationship is concerned. And if you sort of take a long view of the development of the identity factor, you will see that there are basically three stages to this. The first stage, which starts in the 1880s, is a stage when you have the emergence of majority and minority as categories on the subcontinent for the first time. And through these categories, the relationship between Hindus and Muslims, that relationship comes to be politicized. And at the heart of that politicization was the process. There's this sense that the interests of the Hindus and the Muslims as majorities and minorities were different. And this then, up until the 1930s, basically, drove the politics of the two communities in relation to each other. So identity was very, very important in this first stage. In the second stage, which is late 1930s to about the time of partition, you see Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League basically saying that Muslims are not a minority, that they are a nation. And again, what is nation if not an identity concept? And the Congress was in response to this saying that, look, all Indians constitute a single nation. But you had Hindu nationalists in India who were saying that India is a nation of the majority of the people, and therefore India is a Hindu nation. So again, identity sort of was very central to the politics of the 1940s, and therefore to again the politics that led to partition. And of course, after the partition, the third stage begins, where basically you've had two sets of identities that are locked in a conflictual dyad. On the Indian side, there are secularists and there are Hindu nationalists, and on the Pakistani side, you have those who sort of claim that Pakistan is a Muslim nation, and the others who sort of say that Pakistan is an Islamic nation. But whichever combination of these two sets you take, you're basically looking at irreconcilable identity differences. And to the extent that the identity differences are reconcilable, and given the fact that the identity clash goes much further back than the partition itself, I think it's a much better and a more analytically useful factor in understanding India-Pakistan relations than just the conventional geopolitical one.
Right. That's a fascinating starting point, and it sort of suggests a complexity that traditional analysis today often misses. In your episode on Pulyabazi with Pranay, you argued that the conventional geopolitical lens, which might work for relationships like India-China or US-China, is inadequate for understanding India-Pakistan relations today. Could you elaborate on why these two nations are fundamentally entangled and mutually implicated? And how does this entanglement make traditional geopolitical analysis often misleading?
No, thanks, Aishwarya. In fact, just trying my colleagues who do geopolitics of the subcontinent, trying to get them to see my point of view on this is a part of my academic activism. But let's break this down in the following fashion, right? The conventional geopolitical lens assumes that states are fundamentally driven by calculations of power and influence, and that leaders are basically responding to changing power equations, waxing and waning of influence of competitors, etc. All of this is basically to say that states are responding principally to external or foreign variables, and that domestic factors of politics, of society, culture, or inter-community dynamics, that these have no causal role to play in how states behave. That's the geopolitical lens. Now, of course, there's a way in which India-Pakistan ties have a geopolitical dimension. When, for example, the Pakistanis bring China into South Asia, or when they ingratiate themselves to Donald Trump, they are playing the geopolitics game. And so does India when, for example, it works with Iran or Taliban. It's playing the same geopolitical game. So the geopolitical dimension is, of course, very centrally there. And they are causal factors, and that element is definitely there. But this geopolitical dimension does not go far enough, and I don't think it goes into the heart of the India-Pakistan dynamic. Now, to me, in this dynamic, the two societies, their cultures, their identities, and their community dynamics are very centrally involved. And all of these things, culture, identity, society, and community, they are causal factors in the sense that they shape the India-Pakistan dynamic in a very significant way. And in this sense, they are entangled and mutually implicated. I'll just give you one example of this. In the context of the developments that followed the terror attacks in Pahalgam, the Indian position was, India's claim was, which I think was correct, that the terror attacks were basically aimed at hurting inter-community relations in India. Now, the conventional geopolitical lens would sort of completely miss this, right? Because it would focus on external factors such as who's powerful and how powerful, and whose influence is rising and whose influence is falling. But to me, the Indian claim goes to the heart of the exchange of hostilities in May and the very serious deployment of India's secular and progressive identity in the form of women officers along with the foreign secretary briefing the press about Operation Sindoor. Geopolitical analysis will completely exclude this or not consider them important drivers of the dynamic. To me, they are as important as geopolitical factors in explaining the dynamic. Because if you exclude society, culture, identity, or community, then you're missing out on something very vital. Your analysis will definitely become inadequate, potentially misleading as well.
Right, right. Yeah, there was a gender aspect while a religious aspect to that briefing and what followed after as well. I want to dive deeper into the historical roots of that entanglement. You mentioned and you traced partition's roots to the 1880s with the British census and the politicization of inter-community relations, rather than taking back partition to looking at partition from 1947. What was already in motion by then that made partition a concept that was thinkable?
So Aishwarya, it starts in the 1880s, and I am still very surprised by the amount of neglect that that decade receives from scholars of partition. It's so central. This is roughly what happens. The process which I'm interested in, the process that feeds into the 1947 partition, it actually begins to take shape. And it begins to take shape. It does not crystallize, but it begins to take shape in the 1880s. And there are three things that happen there. The British had been counting heads for some time prior to the 1880s, 1860s, 70s, etc. But after the 1881 census, this was the first proper all India census. And after this census, for the first time on the history of the subcontinent, in the history of the subcontinent, an all India demographic picture emerged. What this census did was that it classified the population of the subcontinent into, a number of categories. But the most consequential of these categories were those of the majority and the minority. Now, it's very important to remember that it is very likely that there was a general understanding prior to this period about who was more in numbers and who was less in any particular region of the subcontinent. But no one in the 17th or previous centuries had a clear and precise all India picture of the relative strength of the two communities in terms of numbers. But in the 1880s, something qualitatively different and something new happened. Majority and minority became official categories of governance, which is to say, categories that had political and policy implications. How did this happen? Recall that the British rationale for ruling India was that they were preparing Indians for self-government. And the Indians themselves were clamoring for self-government. Recall that it was in the 1880s that INC was formed. And one of the demands of the Indian National Congress, that's INC, one of its demands was progressive inclusion of Indians in the governance structure of the colonial state. Now, the prospect of devolution of power or self-government came against the backdrop of the emergence of majority and minority as official categories. Now, what is self-government? Basically, democratically elected government. And what is democracy? Game of numbers. So if you have to play this game, if this game of self-government, of democratically elected government was to play out, then the Hindus who were in the majority would remain perpetually in power because, of course, it's a game of numbers. And from this emerged the fear of majority domination. A fear that was articulated, and this was the third major development of the 1880s. This was articulated at two speeches that Sir Syed Ahmad Khan gave in 1887 and 1888 in Lucknow and Meerut, if my memory serves correctly. Right? So these three developments, the census of 1881, the demands of the Congress, establishment of the Congress, and the demand of Congress for self-government, and the fear of majority domination articulated by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. These three developments, they mark the beginning of the process that led to partition in the following sense. Between 1880s and 1930s, you had a situation where Hindus and Muslims started relating to each other not as cultural entities at the localized level, but as majority and minority that made sense only at the level of the subcontinent. And this then basically transformed the character of inter-community relationship. It politicized that relationship. Majority-minority relations became political, and at the heart of this relationship was the argument that the interests of the two communities were distinct in the context of the devolution of power and the rise of self-government. Now, of course, the British played up this sense, right? And this sense of opposed self interest. And they did this by granting separate electorates to Muslims, which then fueled both the sense of separation and the sense of separatism as more power was devolved. This is what I refer to as politicization of intercommunity relations. Towards the late 1930s, Jinnah said that Muslims are not a minority, they are a nation, and one nation was ranged against another, and their relationship, therefore, was not a relationship of majority and minority locked into a political conflict, but of nation against nation locked into an international conflict. So there is a way in which the relationship internationalized even before Pakistan and India became sovereign states. So there was internationalization before interstatehood. And this, I think, is a fascinating, fascinating story.
It's interesting. All these concepts get lost in our understanding of partition. And thank you so much for bringing that up. I will come to the concept of what you say, the minoritization of communities in just a bit. But today, if we accept that that partition was not inevitable, what were some of the alternate visions for decolonization, like those proposed by Rajendra Prasad or Ambedkar? And why did they fail to gain traction? What lessons can we draw from those failures?
Yeah, again, partition actually was the only option left once the prospects of a civil war became real, especially in the second half of 1946. But the argument that it was inevitable or that it was built into the logic of Hindu-Muslim relations as they developed in the late colonial period, to me, that is untenable. And one way to sort of see that they are untenable is that some of the most serious leaders and thinkers of the time were very seriously thinking about alternatives to partition. And if they thought that it was inevitable, why did they go to such lengths to articulate those alternatives? You mentioned Rajendra Prasad and Dr. Ambedkar, but they're only two of the many who came up with all kinds of interesting ideas. Prasad, for example, basically said that India, when it was taken as a whole, was so diverse that it could not be thought of as a nation. The nation as a category was invalid in its ability to capture the diversity of India. So you had to think of India either as a multinational entity or, and this is interesting, an unnational entity. And he said that a decolonized and independent India must have a state that reflects either this multinational character or unnational character. He said that, India, the Indian state has to be a purely political and a constitutional polity, not get into this business of emotions and identity, which invariably comes with conceptualization of a group or a country as a nation. Look at Ambedkar, for example. He was saying that, look, passions are running high. Everyone's very, very desperate and impatient and angry at the moment. Why don't we do the following? Why don't we take 10 years to figure this out in the following fashion? Let's just create a loose constitutional unity at the level of the subcontinent. Let's call it the All India Council. And within this All India Council, which is a loose constitutional entity that is holding the subcontinent together, we'll create two countries. Let's call them Hindustan and Pakistan. To each one of these countries, we will give an element of domestic sovereignty. And the two countries at the same time will necessarily collaborate on things that are of common interest. Let's say transport, communication, river management, and so on and so forth. And now let this play out. Let this arrangement play out for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, if either of the two parties or both parties believes that this is not working out, that they'd rather go their separate ways, then, let's figure out a way of doing Rai Shumari, whichever way it is, elections, referendum, plebiscite, etc. And let's go our separate ways. But it is possible that when the tempers cool, passions calm, and people are giving more thought to this, and they have tasted a fair bit of domestic sovereignty, they would realize that it's better to work together than to go separate ways. Now, these are two examples of the many that continue to be forwarded in the period. And their objective was basically twofold: preserve the territorial unity of the subcontinent and also ensure that the fears of majority domination that the Muslims faced and felt, that was addressed as well. For all kinds of reasons, these proposals did not gain a lot of traction. Fundamentally, I think they just ran up against, Congress's inability to see the strength of Muslim fear. They ran up against the Muslim Leagues and Jinnah's impatience and desperation. And they ran up against the specter of the Civil War, 1946 onwards. Essentially, they ran up against the contingencies of the time. But they were very, very important. And I think they have two lessons for us today. One is that it's important to not be obsessed with the idea of nation and the sentiment of nationalism, because what nation as an idea and nationalism as a sentiment do is that they make individuals and societies both ungenerous and unimaginative. The second thing that this sort of, to me, suggests is it's important to not deify sovereignty, not make, a god out of sovereignty. You have to be willing to compromise on sovereignty if it solves your problems, as the Manmohan Musharraf formula once promised to do.
Yeah, yeah. Those are very interesting points. Thank you so much for that, Professor Atul. You suggest that that processes like the homogenization of national identity and the minoritization of communities are also crucial in understanding the broader India-Pakistan conflict. Can you explain to our listeners what these processes entail and how they continue to shape the internal politics as well as bilateral relationship between both these neighbors?
Right. So let's take up homogenization of national identity first, right?
Yeah.
Basically, very simply put, it is the process of getting rid of diversity from how Indians and Pakistanis see themselves as. Today, for example, an Indian can be a follower of a religion or an atheist. They may speak this or that language, belong to this or that ethnic group, eat food of a particular type, and dress a certain way, or identify themselves as this or that in terms of gender. And ditto with Pakistan as well, right? I mean, that's how a diversity-oriented Indian would look like, a diversity reflecting Indian or Pakistani would look like. What homogenization does is that it defines Indians and Pakistanis in monochromatic terms. So an Indian becomes, for example, a Hindi-speaking Hindu displaying masculine characteristics, plus or minus vegetarianism. That's optional. And a Pakistani becomes a Sunni Muslim sans their religion, their regional or linguistic identities, be it Punjabi, Sindhi, Baloch, Pathan, etc. Homogenization produces, therefore, these very curious things called the true Indian and a false Indian, and a true Pakistani and a false Pakistani. And the Honorable Supreme Court of India very recently wondered about the true Indianness of the leader of opposition, right? And what this does is that it shapes what an India or what a Pakistan is. Roughly, this is what homogenization looks like. One nation equals one religion, one language, one sense of history, one this and one that. This process of homogenization has gone on in both the countries, and it basically does two things. One, it delegitimizes or weakens local or regional identities where religious differences are often offset by shared cultures, stories, languages, locally evolved grammars of coexistence, etc. What it does instead is it creates a single scale of collective imagination and belonging. This scale is the national scale. And on this scale, religion becomes the most important. And religious differences are then used to erase shared histories, memories, and culture in terms of language or food or dressing patterns and so on and so forth. And once you have a national identity that is homogenized and simplified in this fashion, you can use that to separate the nationalist from the anti-national within the country, happens in both countries, and use the nationalist energy in both the countries when you're dealing with the other. This is what happens in Pakistan, and this is what happens in India as well. Now let's come to minoritization very briefly. Minorities are a numerical phenomenon, of course they are, but they are also a locational phenomenon. What do I mean by locational here? Minorities exist within the boundaries of the state, but they live outside the realm of the nation. So they are always vulnerable to the custodians of the nation, to the nationalists, as it were. The perpetuation of this vulnerability is what I call minoritization. And to me, in India and Pakistan, it has taken two forms. When a new minority is created, we see minoritization. And when an existing minority is disempowered, we see minoritization. So when, for example, when Pakistan constitutionally declared the Ahmadis non-Muslim, it created a new minority, example of minoritization. Or when Hindus and Christians are targeted in Pakistan for being who they are minoritized in the sense that their vulnerabilities are perpetuated and they are further disempowered. So within the social body of each nation, you have this process of disempowerment going on. And to the extent that there is an interest in each country about the fate of their co-religionist that is a minority in the other country, to that extent, the two countries' relations are also impacted by this process of minoritization. But there is more there, Aishwarya. If the Hindus in Pakistan are accused of being India's sympathizers, and likewise is done with Muslims in India, then you can see how the other is implicated within the self. And this is the entanglement that we were earlier talking about.
This sort of brings me to my final question. It's interesting that you end on this note. I want to ask you, what would it take to move beyond this rigid, sovereignty-driven framework? Is it even possible for India and Pakistan to imagine a relationship that acknowledges their shared history without being perpetually defined by the shadow of partition?
Aishwarya, my feeling is I'm not very sanguine, very optimistic about this anymore. I think this has gone on for well over a century now, close to 150 years. So there's a way in which the basic sociology of India and Pakistan, and in fact, the relationship of the two largest communities of the subcontinent has changed. The basic sociology has changed. But roughly speaking, two lines of thinking still seem to me to be very valid, if not plausible. One is to sort of think about resolving Kashmir itself, which basically today means turning the LOC into international boundary and thus bring in an element of neatness to the separation itself. What this will do is it will not end the conflictual dynamic, but it would lessen it quite significantly. It would make the relationship more geopolitical than it currently is, and it will lessen the salience of the identity factor. And therefore make it a little more manageable, because then you're basically dealing with two entities that are driven not by questions of identity as much as they are by questions of how powerful or powerless the two entities are in relation to each other. The second line of thinking is, of course, to revive something like the Manmohan Musharraf formula. Basically means devolve power, open borders, reimagine sovereignty altogether, but do all of this within a framework for a wider regional economic integration and infrastructural connectivity. This would mean transcending the logic of both partition and sovereignty. And, I think that both these possibilities are nearly non-existent at this stage. I think the sociology of the two largest communities of the subcontinent has fundamentally changed. The sociology of India and Pakistan has also fundamentally changed for there to be any pathway out of the current conflictual boxed-in character.
Right. Atul, that's quite a grim note to end on, but thank you so much for joining us on All Things Policy today and for sharing your unique perspective. I think it's extremely important that we look at partition from a more broader spectrum and taking history into account. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for our listeners for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Aishwarya. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Yes.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.